guess I'm bringing the outside consultant perspective on the municipal bridge management issues. I've not ever worked for a municipality, but for the last 20 years we've been serving them as clients and helping them address their bridge management needs. And so today, today's topic was to speak a little bit about what I have observed and experienced with municipalities with respect to their decision-making process on how to prioritize their bridge projects. And maybe I chose municipal not in a political structure sense, but as a way of capturing this locally owned bridge category here. So this refers to any sort of non-state bridge owner, be it counties or cities or towns, townships, or any of those smaller other miscellaneous organizations. Anybody without the resources of a state agency and the direct federal connections. The responsibilities for those kinds of organizations vary pretty widely for their responsibilities to complete inspections or bridge maintenance or pay for new bridge construction. In some states, the counties have absolutely no responsibility for bridge maintenance, such as in my home state of Virginia. And then you heard Jason mention a minute ago in Michigan how the combined inventory of county bridges exceeds that of the state-owned inventory. So their ownership and their responsibilities vary widely, as do their inventories themselves, both in size of inventory as well as the complexity and the type of structures and even the road networks, whether it's a real urban environment in a city or a very rural location out in a county. But in my experience of dealing with the smaller local bridge owners, I have come to see their inventories categorized in three types of categories. At the small end of the spectrum, there is what I call the tabletop size inventory. I'm somewhat arbitrarily pegging that around 3 dozen or less structures, but these are the smaller inventories, and they also tend to be the smaller type of structures. These agencies, these organizations, they tend to have a limited number of staff in general who are dedicated to the management of those, and they tend to be folks who are wearing other hats. There may be a position which has the title of town engineer, but you may find when you work with them that also that person serves as the postmaster or the public works director, or even, Jason says, school teacher, elementary school teacher. So these are folks juggling bridge inventories on top of a lot of other things. I call it the tabletop size of inventory because in these cases you're able to spread out the files for these bridge inventories all on a conference room table and see and understand the condition of the entire inventory with one sort of brain shot. And when I'm in their offices, I see them gathered around the table, and you can see the end from the beginning, so to speak. They can understand their needs in the big picture all at once, and so setting priorities tends to be fairly straightforward for those type inventories. At the other end of the spectrum, on the large side, is what I'm calling the agency size of inventory. This would be the hundreds to thousands of structures. DOTs almost all fall in this category. Not that many localities, but a few sizable groups do have inventories quite that large. In that case, because of the large inventory, they tend to have staff that are divided into departments, and they have dedicated functions for their purposes. They have an engineering group, an inspection group, a maintenance group. Their management tends to be structured into many different levels and layers, and they tend to be very heavily driven by metrics. So you have a case of visiting their office, you'll see a lot of technology employed. They're using a lot of computer-based evaluations to set their priorities. They can tell you that in District 3, 87% of the joints are in condition state 2. You know, they have a lot of numbers at their disposal and a lot of data to use in the decision-making process, and they take advantage of the advances we've made in the last few years about data management, and so they also are pretty effective at their priority setting. But the group I really wanted to talk about today is the group that falls in the donut hole middle of those two. This mid-range group of inventory owners who have that few dozen to very low hundreds, who have quite a range of complexity perhaps in their inventories. And they have staff that are assigned to deal with this for sure, and they're full-time staff, but usually not many people who are full-time dedicated to the bridge management function alone. And they also struggle with a problem of staff continuity because there's no full-time dedication to the bridge management function. Folks who are trying to move up the career path end up switching to another department or another division, and so they lack the long-term vision from having long-term continuity of staff. They also suffer from having some non-technical management, reporting up through public works directors. That's kind of technical, but once it gets to city managers, town councils, those kinds of things, you're dealing with folks who don't fully appreciate the topic that they're trying to manage here. and they compete with non-transportation demand. So you've got the bridge preservation and repair needs competing against the new high school or the new sewer line project or the library upgrade or whatever goes on. So when I'm in their offices, I sense a lot of frustration and a lot of not being quite sure what to do about this. They have access to a lot of data, but sometimes they're not really collecting full element level inspections, for example. They don't have access to the software for doing the kinds of evaluations of that. So they feel like they're stuck in a spot. Their inventory is too large to spread out on a conference room table and get their hands around it, but not quite big enough to justify the use of some kind of full-blown data metrics. And I found that they were needing help getting their handle on this. Now, let's take one sidestep on the question of bridge data management and remind ourselves how far this has come, because in the last 50 years, our current existence has evolved out of a number of bridge tragedies, tragic collapses that motivated legislation and policy. The 1968 Federal Highway Act kind of kicked it all off after the Silver Bridge collapse, and a few years later there was the development of the National Bridge Inspection Standards. If you go to a file now of a bridge and you flip to the back and you find that first inspection report from the, say, early to mid-1970s, it's probably a single page. It was a typed form perhaps, but it was filled out by hand, maybe using no more than 50 words. And what description there was in quantifying the condition probably said nothing more than good, fair, poor. And as time has moved forward, we got into condition states. Now instead of 3 to choose from, you can have quite a few more, but there's still a single numerical value. Fast forward now to today, we have all of the element level data where every individual element can have several different deficiencies, and each deficiency can be ranked among several condition states. So the amount of data in this industry, like so many others, has exploded with technology, and there's loads of data out there. It's a very data-intensive process, or it can be today, but these folks with that donut-size inventory, they were struggling with how to get their hands around it because they didn't have the resources for the software and for the people, the staff, to invest in that sort of evaluation. So the case study that I wanted to present to you today is one such municipality with that type of inventory. That inventory, which, by the way, I was trying to tell my boss, I wanted to call it the smallmouth bass inventory, because I remember as a kid growing up fishing with my dad, and I would catch a fish which I was pretty proud of on account of not having much success at that normally. And then after pulling it onto the boat and showing it to him, he would point out that it didn't meet some criteria that the game warden had established for keeping the fish. And so I was stuck there between being big enough to be proud of, but not big enough to take home and show mom. So that's kind of how they are. They're in that stuck boat of not small enough to manage on the tabletop, but not quite big enough to manage in the full-blown computer management. So the municipality that I'm going to case study here is the city of Roanoke. This is a city located in the southwest part of Virginia. They are a fully incorporated municipality, which in Virginia means they have 100% responsibility for the bridges within their boundaries, with the exception of interstate bridges. Their inventory is over 100 structures, so a modest size, and 30 of those, nearly a third, are under 25 feet in length, but they do have 8 that are over 500 feet in length. And it's 3 concrete arches from the mid-1930s and 4 fracture-critical structures. So it's a mix of some complexity and some size in there. Again, it's too large to just spread out on a table and really wrap your brain around it all at once. They also have a dedicated engineering department for the city, city engineer and a staff of folks under him, several professional engineers licensed, 2 or 3 folks who have the National Bridge Inspection training for inspection. So they understand the world of bridge ownership in general. They're very well in tune with their obligations for federal requirements, reporting back up through the state. But they still had this desire for this data-driven type program to help them in setting priorities in their decision-making for how to work on their bridge projects. So they came to us in 2011 and asked us to help them with the task of trying to develop this prioritization system, if you will. They wanted it to be a forward-looking program that helped set some priorities they could work towards and get them out of that reactionary mode of trying to respond to the hottest fires. They wanted to help use the system also to establish some budgets for funding requests and to use it as a tool to communicate back up those channels through the non-technical leadership all the way to City Council. And most importantly, they wanted it to be data-driven decision-making, that they could try to get the best use of their money and be consistent year to year. So the goals of this program were to make use of the available data that they had already, okay? So they don't want to be having to go collect yet some other additional data to help run this program. They wanted to boil it down to a single score number for every bridge that could help rank the priority importance for them. This is a single score we would later come to call the priority index. They wanted to customize or tweak that calculation of that index to their own particular preferences for their area, and they wanted it to be no more complex than you could manage in a simple spreadsheet. So the overall approach we took with them was to help develop this customized scoring system that I'll tell you about here in a moment, use that scoring system to rank the projects, but not recognizing that a scoring system this simple couldn't be perfect, and so we consider that scoring to be a shortlisting of candidate structures, and then have a second phase of evaluation of those candidate structures for actually deciding which bridges deserves the priority, and then using that to develop a long-term plan for them to work towards year by year. So first, the score system. We'll talk about how that came to be. I'm going to have a little bit of equation-type approach to this scoring. It is naturally a mathematical exercise in a way, but the point of this talk is not really to show you the calculation itself, as if to say this is a good way to do it. The point is to show you how they customize their calculation to fit their needs and say that that is an approach that others could take as well. So this priority index, as we came to call it, would be a single score that would rank all of the projects by their worthiness for priority. It would go from 0 to 1, 1 being the highest priority and 0 the lowest. And it would be a calculation that would give preference to structures that were in poor condition. Structures that were larger would get a higher priority number. Structures that had heavier traffic volumes would get the higher number. And then any structures with posted weight restrictions because of what that would mean to the local economy. So here's the equation, the simple equation for this priority index. 1 minus the condition ratio on top and the importance factor on bottom. And so you can see, speaking of the math side of it, a higher condition ratio will reflect a bridge in better condition. And so a higher condition ratio will result in a lower priority index. And then a higher importance factor, a more important bridge, if you will result in a higher priority index, and so in that way those two things are capturing what they wanted them to consider. The condition of the bridge then goes into the condition ratio, and those last three priorities that they wanted to make important for their locality, we're rolling them all into this question importance factor. So let's start with the condition ratio first. In order to do this calculation, if you want to put math to how to make a condition number, a single number for the bridge's condition, it first became necessary to assign connection between the general condition ratings, which they wanted to use because they had that data already, the three main condition ratings, superstructure, substructure, and deck. They wanted to prorate those for the asset value, essentially. So we came up with this curve that a condition rating of 9 would correspond to that element being completely valuable, and a condition rating of 2 would have no value left, and then they felt like the shape ought to be sort of nonlinear. And so, again, nothing magic about the curve, and others have done things like this before, but it just shows a variation between an element that's got its full utility and an element that has no utility left at all. And this is important because now they can combine that with an idea of saying, for the entire bridge's value, how do you break out the three main components as contributing to the value of the bridge? And so, again, in their local preference, from their experience with maintenance and the kind of work they expected to do in the future, they wanted to weight the value of the three components of the bridge in this manner here, 30% for the deck, 45% for the superstructure, and 25% for the substructure. Again, nothing to brag about that being particularly a right answer. This just reflects their local preference for the types of bridges they have and the types of projects they expected to work on, to put more weighting on the superstructure and less on the sub. But combining those two then, you could say for a given scenario, let's say, of certain condition ratings on the deck and super and sub, with the weightings that they contribute to the total of the structure, and these three factors here would come off the graph on the previous screen, you can calculate individually and then sum up to the bottom this condition ratio. That would be a single number that tries to capture the condition of the bridge, reflecting the priorities that the locality has. All right, now remember then, so that was the condition ratio on the top. Let's look at the importance factor on the bottom. In that case, they had three areas they wanted to highlight. the traffic, which will be represented by federal item 29, which is already on record for them. And in this case, the higher the ADT, the higher the importance. The bridge size, which they're going to represent as the planned area, length times width, both federal item numbers already on record. So a larger bridge would be considered more important. They've seen from their experience that the larger bridge projects take longer to come to life, and so they wanted to give those an emphasis in that way. And then lastly, the weight restrictions, they want to capture by federal item 70 for the posting status, such that a lower weight limit deserved a higher priority. And they're simply going to mathematically multiply three factors together to get the combined importance factor. So let me show you what they did with these three factors. For ADT, again, here's their local preference. They said, let's take our average ADT in town, which is about 2,000. Let's call that a benchmark of a 1.0 factor. And then talking to them, we developed that they felt like the highest ADT in town deserved a 15% markup, and the lowest AD in town could possibly deserve 15% decrease in that importance factor. But because the average is not anywhere near the middle of the range, it's sort of a more polynomial type shaped curve in order to achieve 15% at the high end, minus 15% at the low end, and 1.0 at the average. Again, nothing fancy about the equation to say it's the new answer, just this is how we fit a curve to the shape of their desires. In the case of the size factor, they agreed to just simply having 1.0 for the smallest bridge and 10% for the largest bridge in their inventory. And then that's nothing more than an equation that just fits that scenario. And then thirdly, for the weight restriction, you know, there is the federal item 70 in the coding that has 0 through 5 representing whether there's any weight restriction relative to legal loads, or if so, 10, 20, 30, 40, or less than 40% benchmark. And so using those 6 code numbers, just making correlation that with no weight restriction gets a 1.0 factor, and with the worst weight restriction deserved a 25% increase in the importance factor. So again, the same thing. Nothing about the equation that's fancy, just fitting to the shape of their local preferences. So then, coming back to that main priority index equation, we can combine all three of those in the bottom. When we first did this in 2011 was when they first came to us about that. Here's a snapshot of some of the results they found for their bridges. This is right off the top of the list when they are all sorted in order of the priority index. And you can see that there is a condition ratio for each and an importance factor for each, which represents the denominator of the fraction. So just a few things to point out of interest. For example, one of the lowest condition ratios, which would be to say one of the worst condition bridges, is in fact in the middle of the priority range because it also was affected by being of lower importance. Likewise, the highest importance bridge on the list that I've captured here was not at the highest priority because it was also in pretty good condition. And then thirdly, the bridge that was ranked as the top priority index, arguably the first for consideration in the projects, is still one that has a fairly low importance factor, but it was influenced by having such a low condition ratio. So it sort of accomplished the goal of melding, wanting to work on the bridges that are in the worst condition, but also work on the bridges that are most important to us in a relatively simple, data-based, objective kind of fashion. But remember, I told you the first thing was getting the scoring, but the scoring isn't the answer. You can't take this list and just say, all right, we're going to start at the first one, then we'll do the second one and the third one, because it's a fairly simplified approach, and naturally there's going to be some results that are not necessarily in agreement with the intuition of the local agency. So we considered it just a short listing, and then we found through our iterations early on that the 0.6 priority index value was kind of a cutoff line between projects that were worth considering or not. And through the reiterations of this process over time, that usually results out of their inventory of 100, about 10 or so bridges worth considering. And then we just go down through the list of 10 in the fashion of short list consideration. We develop alternatives for each one, whether it's a repair alternative, maintenance work, rehabilitation, or complete replacement. Consider each of those alternatives, weigh out the pros and cons and cost estimates, and then use some judgment in there. So we're by no means trying to eliminate the value of human judgment, But basically what it does is it takes their inventory that was too large to get their hands around at first and lets this short list become their tabletop size inventory for consideration. And now it's down to a manageable size you really can wrap your brain around. So we went through the exercise of evaluating the alternatives, making some recommendations, produced this, they call it the State of the Structures report, that summarizes not only the results but the process. Even includes in the back a single-page project profile for each of the recommendations that has a little summary of the condition of the bridge, what the alternatives were considered, and what's recommended going forward. So they can use this tool not only for their data-driven planning purposes, but a way of communicating to the likes of city managers, town council type folks who are not as informed with the process. It demonstrates to those managers a dedicated commitment to the data-driven process. It gives them a sense of confidence in the decision-making as well. So with that data-driven planning, customized by the local values as I've demonstrated, and it's been easy to update for them as a follow-up activity, but still demonstrating the importance of the human professional judgment that definitely is not set aside as a part of this process, and that they were able to use that as a communication tool. So it's proven successful since the inception. When we first started on this in 2011, published the first report in 2012, I think they've completed 7 projects and have several others in the works. So it's definitely working for them. Again, like, I mentioned several times, not to say these are the equations for everybody, but to the localities, I would say the message is you could customize something like this to your own particular situations, your own inventory structure types, your own ADT posting situations. Get with your favorite consultant and work with them to work something up like that. And for the state and federal folks in the room, like Jason did a fine job here before me, helping the localities where you can, whether it's technical resources, just advice, the kind of funding, helping them get through environmental processes are often a bogged down point. Whatever you can do to support them, definitely appreciated. And I don't know if we have any folks who are either in academia or maybe on committees that are working on the continuing evolution of this data collection. I encourage you to remember the value of simplicity as well as the rigorous nature of that program. So if there's any questions, I'll be glad to entertain them.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm really interested in all the math formulas. Were those developed by your company, or are they something that's out of a bridge manual? Just wondering where they came from.
So the formulas themselves, nothing particularly special. It was more the process of sitting down over the course of several meetings and trying to extract from the locality there what was going to be important to them. And there were a number of iterations. Of course, I didn't show you the sausage making process here, just the end product, but trying to get them to come to terms with what was really going to be the emphasis of the program. And then once we understood that, it was just a matter of best fitting some curves that kind of gave the right shape to give the results that they were after. So in a different locality, for example, there was the one curve about how the ADT affected the results, but in a different locality where the roads had different ADTs, that would obviously be the wrong equation. It would give an emphasis to the wrong level of ADT. So whether their ADT was higher or lower, the shape of the curve might be similar, but the numbers would have to change. But the point is to be able to influence the math results in a way that's customized to the locality.
Maybe I missed it, but was there any thought to economic impact, such as job creation, or schools, or fire department location, any location, and those kind of things?
Right. So, for example, there is even already on record some federal items for the length of detour required on a bridge closure, for example. And so this is a good way to emphasize the nature of customizing the process, because in their world, in their inventory of 100 bridges, they happen to know that that wasn't generally a problem for them. In some other locality, for sure, that could drive the entire scope of a project. But they happen to know in their case, knowing their inventory the way they do, that that isn't an issue that separates one project priority from another. So you see it absent from their consideration, even though in another locality it might be a primary consideration.
So you've been doing this, I think you said, since 2011, right?
For the city of Roanoke, right.
So what have you seen in terms of the condition of their network, and has this had any influence on funding decisions that the city of Roanoke has done over that time?
No, that's a good question. So I mentioned they've tackled, I think it's about 7 projects that are completed or nearly so that were identified through this. They've been very fortunate into receiving a good reception, a positive reception from the city council, where a lot of the city funding decisions are made, and also the city manager supportive of this effort. And so with the city manager and the city council supportive of that, they've been able to get committed, dedicated year after year funds, local funds, put towards this program. It still is difficult. So for them, in that case, the local funding contribution, we might be talking about hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars, but not millions and millions of routine annual type money. And then they can do bond issues to raise capital for certain express projects. So when they have to tackle a $12 million bridge replacement, complete replacement, that takes the kind of capital raising. But there also is, in Virginia, there is the opportunity from time to time for localities to apply to the state for some various forms of funding that they can perhaps match 50-50 or something like that. And they've been successful at utilizing those because they have the priorities identified. And there is an increasing emphasis on valuing localities that have a thorough process, right? They can demonstrate how they came to this priority, and there seems to be increasing value for that as well. Also, the advantage of having spent a few years knocking off the higher priority projects means that they've been very effective also in turning attention to more preventive maintenance type activities. So they can shift the focus from trying to tackle the worst off the list. I say shift the focus. They had wanted to do priority preventive maintenance for some time and had been doing some of it already, pretty effective, but this has allowed them to become more effective at it. So we just in fact finished refiguring the priority indices for a new round, and you can see that the highest of the index values is lower than several of them were the last time around. So it's a kind of quantifiable metric of the improvements that the program is making.
The 7 projects, what kind of projects were they doing? I assume it was to improve I forget what you called it, but the condition rating part, but what kind of things were they doing?
That's a good question. They range from probably the simplest was a replacement of an overlay on a relatively small low water bridge, and the greatest was a $15 million complete replacement of a bridge over 10 railroad tracks, tearing down the old substructure and everything and completely replacing it. So they ranged from the small to the large, and the funding, of course, followed with that, some fairly affordable projects up to very expensive projects. But the effect of getting the condition there, part of that evaluation stage, after you get the short list and you evaluate the alternatives, it sort of included several scenarios, and the scenario would be what would be the likely condition rating at the end of this project, and what are we going to spend. And so because they had that, remember the S-shaped curve that put condition ratings to asset value, if you will, you can assign a dollar value to the entire structure's worth, and using that type breakdown, capture a financial improvement that you got out of a financial investment, kind of a simplified cost-benefit ratio.
Did you ever do a comparison to the health index scores, just for fun?
This is the part that comes out of the MBI, the National Bridge Data. So the part of the problem is in Virginia, the localities are only required to turn in element level data for National Highway System structures. And so they don't have MBI, element level data for a good 2/3 or more of their inventory. So there was no way to do it system-wide. I've not tried to circle back around on the few that I could. It's a good idea, though. Let's look into that.
The preceding was produced by the National Center for Pavement Preservation. More information can be found on the web at pavementpreservation.org. Additional support provided by Michigan State University.